After all these years, I still remember Uncle Winston as a kind and gentle soul. His true name was widely known on the news, yet my parents always insisted I keep it a secret. Even without a fancy team or bodyguards, his reputation was so great that I was warned never to reveal his real identity. I often found myself dodging nosy reporters after school, their questions about his personal life making little sense to me. I never saw him as a powerful leader in a suit. To me, he was simply an ordinary man who took charge of our family cookouts. His knack for wearing perfectly coordinated outfits and never forgetting a birthday call made him special. We believed that no matter what happened, Uncle Winston could always make things right. That gentle reliability made us feel secure, even when troubles arose. Every summer, I eagerly awaited the chance to visit his sprawling country manor. It wasn't just the large pool, wide-open yard, or tall, echoing halls that excited me. It was spending time with my cousins. My younger cousin, Riley, who was only a few months my junior, and Mason, 2 years my senior, had been my partners in mischief since we were toddlers. One warm evening, Mason let slip a secret that would change our lives. We were sprawled on the floor of Riley's room, feeling sluggish after overindulging in Aunt Lisa's famous tropical cake. Though wide awake, none of us had any idea what to do next. The grown-ups had dimmed the lights and declared bedtime, but their room was so far away that we knew the night belonged to us. In that quiet darkness, our imagination stirred with the promise of adventure. Without warning, Mason shot up with an excited grin, insisting he had discovered something astonishing earlier that day. He explained that while playing hide-and-seek in the woods, he had found a small, hidden door inside an abandoned shed, left carelessly unlocked by someone. I caught a hint of skepticism in Riley's eyes, yet the lure of mystery was irresistible. Despite my doubts, I pressed him for more details. Mason led us quietly out of the house, moving past the slumbering adults with careful steps. Standing at the front door, I felt an unusual mix of excitement and nervousness at the thought of being caught. Although we'd sneaked around before, tonight felt different. We slipped into the yard and then into the dense forest, where every rustle and whisper heightened our anticipation. The cool night air was filled with the sound of crickets and the soft brushing of wet leaves, making the woods feel wild and endless. We hadn't brought a light, yet Mason seemed to know the way by heart. Ahead, through a break in the trees, we found a small clearing where a plain gray shed sat under a utility pole. It looked like nothing more than a forgotten building meant for maintenance work. But when Mason carefully opened its door, a faint glow caught our eyes from the floor, a secret hatch that we'd never noticed before. A strange uneasiness crept over me as I wondered why anyone would leave it uncovered. Before I could voice my concern, both Riley and Mason pried the hatch open, its hinges creaking loudly in the still night. A narrow ladder led down into a bright tunnel that seemed to defy the darkness above. The passage was free of dust and cobwebs, hinting that it was used often. I followed my cousins, though an inexplicable chill stayed with me as we descended. The tunnel's walls, formed of interlocking cylindrical sections, gave me an odd feeling, almost as if they were parts of some enormous creature. Even with lights spaced evenly along the way, I couldn't shake the worry that they might suddenly go out. At the tunnel's end, we emerged into a vast, round chamber. We found ourselves on a second level with rows of benches arranged as if in a small auditorium. Far below, a circle of 14 sturdy metal supports held up the structure, with a drain in the center adding to the mystery. The room reminded me of ancient arenas, though it was hidden deep within the forest near Uncle Winston's estate. I whispered that we really shouldn't be here, my voice echoing off the bare walls. Mason teased me for my caution, though I sensed he was anxious too. After a tense moment, we decided to climb back up the ladder and close the hatch behind us. Once outside, the whole experience felt surreal, as if it had been a vivid, unsettling dream. The next morning, a lingering sense of unease made me secretly wish that my stay at Uncle Winston's manor would end quickly. Riley, Mason, and I woke up with a vague discomfort that colored our morning routine. Mason, in particular, was visibly upset and retreated to his room in tears. When Uncle Winston gently inquired about our moods, I wanted to confess everything, but a sharp look from Riley silenced me. I mumbled something about overeating cake and trudged off to the bathroom to wash away the remnants of the night. I avoided looking into the mirror, afraid it might reflect the strange memories we shared. After splashing cold water on my face, I returned to a slowly brightening kitchen where the earlier heaviness began to lift. By afternoon, I almost convinced myself that our adventure had been nothing more than a bizarre dream. Later that day, noticing our quiet disputes, Uncle Winston decided to be lenient and let us stay up late to play video games. We were later found asleep on the living room carpet, our secret tucked away between us. For a while, life seemed to settle back into normalcy, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. That winter, when our families gathered at Uncle Winston's estate for the holidays, the manor felt alive with activity. The house featured a real wood-burning fireplace and a large hill behind it perfect for sledding. Unfortunately, the weather was uncooperative, with long stretches of gray skies and no snow at all. One particularly blustery night, I awoke to the sensation of something tugging at my feet under the blankets. Riley was there, quietly mentioning she'd seen strange lights in the sky. Not long after, Mason appeared, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and the three of us pressed our faces against a frosted window. We watched as faint, glowing orbs drifted slowly across the dark sky, heading directly toward the old shed. Before we knew it, Riley dashed off toward Uncle Winston's room to alert the adults. Mason and I exchanged worried glances as she disappeared, and when she returned alone, she explained that Aunt Lisa had rushed off to deal with an emergency and that Uncle Winston was not home. The three of us vowed to remain awake until Uncle Winston returned, though the coziness of our beds soon overwhelmed us. None of us managed to stay up until dawn, and eventually I was awakened by the sound of heavy, unsteady footsteps in the hallway. The stumbling, accompanied by quiet sobs, filled me with a sense of dread. Yet I hesitated to wake my cousins, uncertain if it was really Uncle Winston in distress. At breakfast, I was startled to see Uncle Winston looking completely refreshed and upbeat, dressed in his favorite robe. He had prepared a stack of pancakes and cheerfully flipped them in a pan, even though a light dusting of snow lay outside over a muddy ground. When Mason announced that we were going sledding, Uncle Winston merely raised an eyebrow, took a sip of his coffee, and rejoined the conversation with the other adults. Riley and I suspected that the sledding was merely a distraction from the events of the previous night. Later, trudging through the slippery frozen yard, we discovered that a new padlock had been fixed on the shed door. For a long moment, no one said anything, as Mason simply shrugged as if accepting fate. Then, Riley produced a tiny brass key from her key ring, a key she claimed to have found on her father's dresser the previous night, and unlocked the door with it. In that moment, none of us wanted to know more about the secret beneath the shed, and we silently walked back home. For nearly 2 years, the mysterious shed was never mentioned again. Whenever Riley or Mason noticed odd lights in the sky or mysterious late-night trips by Uncle Winston, they kept quiet. Meanwhile, Mason began to change noticeably as he grew older, sometimes lashing out in anger or acting in ways that worried both Riley and me. It seemed that the ordinary boy we once knew was being replaced by someone seeking dangerous thrills. Mason started spending time with older kids, whose idea of fun was far riskier than anything we'd ever done. One of these new friends, a thin boy named Cody, once startled an elderly neighbor by crashing into him on a skateboard just for a laugh. On another occasion, a girl named Lila threatened Riley if she didn't help her snatch something from a local shop. I wasn't sure if these acts were genuine or just empty bravado, but they left me unsettled. When Mason casually mentioned that he had no special plans for his 15th birthday, a deep, unsettling feeling took hold of me. That evening, Uncle Winston hosted a quiet family dinner with a lavish spread, but Mason's somber tone and biting sarcasm made it hard to enjoy the meal. Later that night, while lying in bed, I heard the soft sound of a backpack zipping and bottles clinking, followed by a timid knock on my door. To my surprise, Mason appeared, whispering that he was planning a small party and inviting me to join him. Even though I felt uneasy about Mason's new companions, I agreed to go along, not wanting him to face danger alone. We slipped out of the house and made our way down the dark driveway. Mason led me along a narrow road with a flashlight, and soon another beam of light joined us. Cody, Lila, and a quiet boy named Nate had arrived. Their enthusiastic greetings made me feel even more like an outsider, as they patted Mason on the back and barely acknowledged me. We continued into the woods, confident that Mason wouldn't lead strangers to the shed. Yet before long, we reached the same clearing we'd seen before. Mason pulled out a set of keys, allegedly a spare copy from his father, and without waiting for my protest, he pushed forward and unlocked the door. "If you're scared, you can turn back," Nate jeered, but I chose to stay, unwilling to abandon Mason in his risky venture. Inside, the hidden passage beneath the shed was just as we remembered, cold, dark, and oddly silent. Cody immediately hopped on his skateboard, its wheels clicking against the smooth walls as he sped along. Nate mixed a bit of old liquor with soda from a bottle he carried, passing it around as if it were a trivial matter. When Cody attempted a trick on his board and failed, he even made a crude gesture toward Lila, who responded with a nervous laugh. Soon, we reached a vast, dome-like room, supported by a ring of heavy metal beams. Mason improvised a rope by tying our jackets together, and we descended into the center of the space. We banged on the supports and even tried pushing them, yet we remained clueless about their purpose. As boredom set in among the group, Cody suggested that he and Lila go explore further, a plan that Mason attempted to join until Lila tripped him up. Mason's fall left him visibly shaken, and while we tried to help him, his anger flared as he glared at his new friends. Then suddenly, hurried footsteps echoed from a side passage, and the mood shifted instantly. "Someone's coming," Cody whispered, and Lila quickly scrambled behind him, fumbling with her clothes. I scanned the room for a hiding spot, realizing that our only chance was to escape before we were discovered. In our panic, we raced toward the ladder, only to realize we were heading in the wrong direction. Out of the darkness emerged a group of well-dressed adults who carried themselves with an air of authority. I recognized a few of them from news reports, and one stern man with a shaven head and a guarded expression glared at us, his hand hovering near what looked like a weapon. Before I could react, Uncle Winston's firm voice commanded us to stand down. Mason and I were released from our precarious position, and as I looked up, I saw the adults gathering around us in hushed confusion. A gruff security chief demanded to know about Cody, Lila, and Nate, while Uncle Winston quietly questioned Mason, who insisted he'd never met those strangers before. The atmosphere was tense, and I felt as if the room were closing in on us. Uncle Winston knelt down, placing his hands on our shoulders, and told us we were coming with him, his tone both gentle and resolute. He explained that though he shared our apprehension, it was essential for us to learn the truth about this hidden place. He instructed us to remain silent and avoid drawing attention as we joined a gathering of influential figures in the room. The whispers of the well-dressed crowd and the heavy silence around us made everything feel surreal. I felt trapped in a situation that was far beyond anything I could have imagined. Peering down into a lower chamber, I saw a group of people chained between the sturdy metal beams. They wore bulky protective suits, and their limbs were stretched out so tightly that they could not move. Their eyes met one another in silent confusion, as if they didn't understand why they were there. The sight was so disturbing that it seemed more like a twisted display than anything else. I tried to look away, but Uncle Winston nudged me with his foot, silently urging me to watch what was coming next. A low, metallic rumble vibrated through the room, and I realized the design of the ceiling was meant to reveal a hidden vertical passage. From above, a massive dark shape began to lower itself slowly, its form blocking out the man-made lights. Uncle Winston gripped our shoulders tighter, his expression revealing both protectiveness and fear. The descending object was vast and mysterious, a rough mass that reminded me of something I had once seen in an entirely different context. I struggled to recall a similar image, but all I could think of was a deflated ball from a childhood game, transformed over time into something unrecognizable. Tiny lights flickered along its edges, and it emitted a high, steady hum that vibrated deep within me. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, even though I tried to push it away. Before we could process the horror before us, Mason and I clung to each other as the dark mass settled among the chained captives. For a long moment, it hovered silently. Then the captives began to cry out in anguish. Mason shifted beside me, desperate to rush forward, but Uncle Winston held him back firmly. It was then that I noticed the skin of the captives gradually losing its color, as if dissolving slowly before our eyes. The transformation was gruesome. Thick, foamy layers of skin peeled away, pooling on the floor between their desperate struggles. An unsettling, savory odor filled the space, a smell disturbingly similar to something fried. One by one, each person's appearance changed until they became flat, lifeless shapes that looked more like empty husks than human beings. Even in their agony, it was clear they were still alive, trapped in a state of unbearable torment. After what felt like an eternity, the dark object drifted away as silently as it had arrived. The well-dressed onlookers stood in stunned silence, as though they were accustomed to such sights, yet still deeply affected. Uncle Winston quickly led Mason and me away from the scene, leaving us with a torrent of unspoken questions. I wanted to ask so much, but fear choked my voice, and I could only watch as the experts began discussing the incident in low, measured tones. Later, Uncle Winston explained that many believed the mysterious forces drew energy from human suffering. He said that wherever they appeared, devastation followed without exception. Despite billions spent on various attempts, military drills, high-tech experiments, even nuclear tests, the entities remained unchallenged. Their presence continued unabated, and it seemed that a secret network was responsible for constructing these hidden facilities to contain them. With each word, I felt the weight of a terrible truth pressing down on me. Walking back under the cool night air, I couldn't help but wonder how many people had vanished without a trace, lost to forces no one truly understood. The memory of those chained victims haunted me, and I realized that Uncle Winston's secret organization was still very much active. Every step on the dew-covered grass reminded me that I was now a part of a dark, hidden world. I felt trapped by the knowledge, unable to forget what I had witnessed. Then, one summer brought more life-changing news. Mason was finishing his advanced studies and had received promising job offers from respected institutions in the capital. Just as excitement began to replace our sorrow, tragedy struck. Uncle Winston collapsed during a local running event and passed away before help could reach him. His sudden loss was inexplicable, especially since he had never shown signs of illness before. Aunt Lisa, in a surprisingly detached manner, announced that she would be leaving on a spiritual retreat in Europe to seek solace. Mason was left to handle the funeral arrangements, a responsibility that weighed heavily on him. The ceremony was simple and understated, with only a few close friends attending in plain, dark attire. In the end, Uncle Winston's death barely registered in the local news, and he became just another forgotten name. At the service, my mind wandered to that hidden shed and what might happen to the secret project now that its founder was gone. I wondered if Mason and I would be forced to keep carrying this burden of silence, or if even darker consequences lay ahead. The questions swirled in my head as I left the ceremony, a mix of grief and dread overwhelming me. A couple of days later, Mason invited me back to the old manor. That gray, overcast afternoon, the house looked deserted, with no cars in the driveway and its windows dark and empty. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and knocked on the door. Mason answered immediately, his expression serious and his appearance disheveled from days of neglect. He offered little explanation about Riley's absence, only shrugging before asking if I was willing to take a walk with him. Despite feeling hesitant, I agreed, knowing that he would explain everything along the way. We set off down an unmarked path that felt both familiar and ominous. Mason assured me that the strange lights appeared only at night, as if following a hidden schedule. Before long, we reached the shed again. Using the same old key from Uncle Winston's collection, Mason unlocked the door and led me back down into the pristine tunnels. Though he claimed we would be alone, I couldn't help but sense that we were being watched. As we walked in silence, Mason asked if I remembered what Uncle Winston had once said about protecting others, even if it meant sacrificing a few lives. I nodded, though the memory of that dreadful night still made me feel ill. Then, with a sudden heaviness in his voice, Mason sighed and remarked that his father's ideals had ultimately fallen short. I tried to ask him what he meant, but before he could explain further, I became aware of soft footsteps following us. Mason stopped abruptly and rested a hand on my shoulder, his eyes dark with a mix of determination and sorrow. Slowly, Mason reached into his coat and produced a small syringe filled with a clear liquid. In a barely audible tone, he said, "I'm sorry, but this must end for everyone's sake." Before I could react, he lunged toward me with the syringe. The soft footsteps quickened behind us, and in that terrifying moment, I knew that if the injection succeeded, I would be lost. In a burst of desperate energy, Riley burst into the tunnel, wielding a fire extinguisher as if it were a weapon. The loud impact sent Mason reeling, and he dropped the syringe as he staggered. For a few agonizing seconds, chaos reigned in the dark passage as Riley clutched her arms in shock. Mason, enraged and confused, kicked me when I tried to intervene before lunging at Riley. In the ensuing melee, I scrambled toward the ladder, my hands slick with sweat as I fumbled for a way out. I managed to climb back up and secure the shed door behind me, my heart pounding with every heavy breath. Outside, in the light drizzle, I stood frozen. Home no longer felt like home, and I knew that the hidden world Uncle Winston had created was far from finished. All I could do was hope that if fate chose to claim me, it would be swift.